Can't get out of my bed. There's a thought crime running through my head. Can't take these rules, and people are fools who believe what they read and believe what they see. Believe what they see on the TV. Opinions are like iPhones.
Hello, welcome to episode 5 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. Got a bit of a cold today, so forgive me for that. I have got dosed up to get the energy for this. So today, it's going to be questions from listeners and friends and family, in fact, and what I call Beatle heads, which is Beatles experts, in this case people who have their own podcasts about the Beatles and also authors in many cases. So what I was asking for was not quiz questions, but questions or talking points to give me the chance to ramble on and go off on all kinds of tangents. Had some good feedback on the Rod Davis interviews in the last 2 episodes. A lot of people were talking about the recording, echoing kind of what I said, that they didn't really understand why there was a slow and a fast version of putting on the style. That has baffled me. I know Rod was saying in the interview that he thought that they just speeded up because maybe they just had bad timing, but I don't know. I'd like to get to the bottom of that, but I think the full tape will surface at some point. Maybe we'll get an answer then, but who knows. So anyway, let's crack on.
Answer my question!
All right, I'm answering it. Relax. Here's the first one. This is a friend of mine, Porrig O'Connor, who's a very, very talented songwriter here in Madrid. What's your opinion of Yoko Ono? Now, like Porrig, I'm not really into Yoko bashing. I will criticise her, but I think there's been a fair amount of that. Actually, the I've Got a Beatles podcast, they did a show all about her music, and I was a bit worried that they were going to trash it. And they gave a very sort of even-handed and many aspects complimentary opinion of Yoko, while, criticising in justifiable ways at the same time. As regards her, I guess we have to talk about her artistically and personality-wise. Artistically, well, I may have already said this in a previous podcast, but I read a book recently called The Beatles and the Avant-Garde. It was exactly what it said. Avant-garde, as we know, basically means progressive, vanguard, experimental music. George Harrison famously described it as avant-garde a clue. But he was pretty avant-garde, as were all the Beatles in their own way, perhaps less so Ringo. But anyway, this book went through each Beatle plus Yoko, and when I got to the Yoko part, I must say that when I read it, when I finished reading it, I did feel this incredible sense of freedom. And if you expose yourself to the world of Yoko's music and art, you do really get that feeling that really anything is possible, and you can call anything art as well. Now that of course, that idea is open to criticism, because then that's saying, I could record myself breathing for 2 minutes and call it art. My take on that is really whether or not it gets a reaction from the audience. I teach a lesson about this, actually, an English lesson. First of all, I get the students to say, what is art? And they generally, would be with advanced classes, they generally come up with something like trying to express a feeling or a piece of work that's crafted. So really, Yoko Ono, when she did her cut piece, which I think is a great one, where she invites the audience members to cut off a piece of clothing. I'm not entirely sure whether she actually did the whole show where she ended up naked. I'm not sure about that, but we know from the Two Virgins album cover that she wasn't afraid of being naked, and I think that was one of the things that naked, either literally, physically, or metaphorically or spiritually, perhaps. And John Lennon was definitely attracted to that about her. So I think on the plus side, this sort of sense of freedom I get from being exposed to her work. It is tough listening, but then what's actually wrong with that? If you want easy listening, listen to any crap on the pop charts. I can't say I've spent long amounts of time with Yoko's music, but, for example, Walking on Thin Ice, which is, of course, has an eerie quality to it because it was John Lennon was recording guitar on that night he was killed. I would definitely listen to that, and there's no doubt either that she was progressive, because, the famous story is when John Lennon was in Bermuda, he heard Rock Lobster by the B-52s. This was in 1980. And he rang up Yoko and said, they finally caught up with you. So I would definitely say that about her work. But at the same time, maybe should you say anything is art, because a performance piece is one thing, Similarly with David Blaine, if anyone's heard of him, the American illusionist. I was quite captivated in 2003 where he was suspended in a glass box and didn't eat for 44 days. I'm leaving aside whether you think there was an illusion to that. He did lose something like 5 stone, but anyway, I'm rambling now. That was about the reaction. Of course, the difference is when you put out a record, yes, you might get a reaction from music critics, but you're kind of, nowadays, okay, you can listen to things, you can listen to lots of tracks and more or less hear most of the album before you actually have to spend any money buying it. But in those days, it wasn't the same thing. So I would say that, but you know what you're going to get. It's like if you go to a Jerry Sadowitz comedy show, you're not going to get tame jokes. You're going to get things that might well offend you, but don't go to his show then. That's what he said. I saw him once in Melbourne at the comedy festival there. So anyway, yeah, her music, yeah, I would recommend checking it out for sure. I like the Yoko Ono Plastic Ono Band album and also the Fly album. I think that's 1970 and 1971. But the best thing I think would be listen to a few tracks and see what you think. As a person, I mean, I'm very loath to make too many judgments about famous people because I've obviously never met her. I would just say read the books and make your own mind up, Did she dig her claws into John Lennon? I think I discussed in an earlier podcast that I think she did kind of bring him back to life because he was going through a serious funk in 1967 and was doing way too much acid by all accounts. I do have a few opinions on the John and Yoko myth, however. I will do a show in the future comparing the Ray Coleman and Albert Goldman books. And there's definitely a lot to dig into there about what was John Lennon's state of mind between 75 and 80 and what was his relationship with Yoko. I think there's too many books that have come out now saying that their relationship was probably fairly sexless by 1980. Of course, we don't know what would happen. Relationships go in waves, as anyone who's been in a relationship knows. But John Lennon, the fascinating thing, he was so enigmatic that he could almost say lots of different things at the same time, and he kind of perpetuated the myth in the interviews when he came back on the scene in 1980, but then at the same time dropped hints, a rather large hint being something I touched on in episode 2, the famous photo where he's for Playboy with Annie Leibovitz, where he's naked and Yoko's fully clothed, and he said, that's our relationship. So he's kind of saying that on the one hand they're lovers and their relationship's still very fertile, at the same time he's completely dependent on her, and he's famous quotes, Yoko sees men as assistants. John Lennon was, let's be honest, sort of telling porky pies in the interviews when he came back, one of which was, my guitar was hung up on the bed and I didn't take it down for 5 years, implying that he didn't do anything for 5 years, which is absolutely not true, and that the songs from Double Fancy and Milk and Honey were in fact the opposite of inspirational. There may have been some inspiration, I'm not saying there wasn't, but actually they were a lot of the times taken from 2 or 3 different songs that he'd been sort of jamming on the piano and the guitar for years, it seems, and put them together. So if I had to guess, I mean, my opinion doesn't really mean anything on this score, but would they have stayed together? I would say probably no. Or either that or the John Yoko myth would have been somewhat exposed. I could talk a lot more for that, but thanks for that question. Another one. This one is very easy to answer, actually. Did John Lennon say Ringo's not even the best drummer in the Beatles? So, yeah, there was this myth that an interviewer had asked John Lennon, was Ringo the best drummer in the world? And John Lennon apparently had said he's not even the best drummer in the Beatles. Now, Beatles experts will know this already, others may not, but the answer to that question is absolutely not. He did not say that. That was actually a joke said by Jasper Carrott, who's an English comedian and TV personality. I think he's still around, hope so. I remember growing up in the 80s watching him. His name was spelt double T, not exactly like the vegetable. But he was a guy who, I remember on Saturday nights, he seemed to be always on TV, and he was either standing with a microphone or sitting down just talking in a humorous way about TV and society, I guess. And all his shows always had the word carrot in their title. Carrot Confidential was one I remember. Anyway, Mark Lewison in the Tune-In book says that in his research he found that Jasper Carrott had said this. Some of his old clips are actually quite good because he's a guy from Birmingham and he uses the accent. The Brummie accent can sound sort of quite laconic, and I think Carrott uses it to full advantage. Also, his daughter was Dawn in the British version of The Office, Lucy Davis. So his real name's Davis, not Carrot, believe it or not. Okay. Now, if you remember Teresita, gave me some feedback. Teresita from Tenerife. And she said, who are your favourite unknown John Lennon songs? So I'm going to take that to mean my favourite lesser-known John Lennon songs. There may still be unknown ones that are going to come out in the future, but we'll see. I've just chosen one from his Beatles career and one from his solo career. And these are not unknown songs, of course. But to the public at large, who are not hardcore Beatles fans, they may not be that well known. And I'm going to choose a song from the White Album, Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey. Obviously, this has had a bit of play recently because of the White Album 50th anniversary, but definitely not one of the better-known Beatles songs. But it's a fantastic rocker, and it's got I love the idea of using a fire bell as a kind of a musical instrument. I think it was Paul just ringing this fire bell manically while they were recording this song. And of course, apart from the incredibly unique title, the monkey was either Yoko or heroin, depending who you believe. But the fact that the lyrics were quoting the Maharishi, and of course they'd just come back from India, so your inside is out when your outside is in. Deeper you go, the higher you fly. Some great lyrics in there, and the fact that he quoted the Maharishi after apparently being very angry with him, which led to the Sexy Sadie song. I thought that was interesting, so I'd go with that one. Solo, I would go with Crippled Inside. Again, I'm not saying it's my favourite John Lennon song, but it's one of those ones that I always had a soft spot for. A lot of it's very contextual, I remember watching the original Imagine film that came out, I think, first of all in 1972. I obviously didn't see it then because I wasn't born, but I saw that. There was a great video for Crippled Inside, the one that had John Lennon playing basketball with Miles Davis, and Jack Nicholson appears at some point, Andy Warhol. I love that song because of the juxtaposition of the bouncy countryness of it, and then the lyrics. It's you can shine your shoes and wear a suit. So a very up-tempo sort of, some people might call it cheesy country. John even said it was in the Imagine, the Give Me Some Truth film, he's telling, I think it's Tariq Ali, isn't it? I've just written one called Crippled Inside. It's a corny country and western song.
You can go to church and sing a hymn. You can judge me by the color of my skin. You can live a lie till you die. Dun, 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 dun. One thing you can't hide is when you're crippled inside.
But then the lyrics, you can shine your shoes and wear a suit. You can comb your hair and look quite cute. And you can hide your face behind a smile. Great stuff, And apparently, some people would say that was about Paul McCartney. This is a little link to the next question, actually. I think it was about John Lennon as well. I think he was writing about himself. So check those out. Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey, and Crippled Inside. So the next question is from a gentleman called Owen Ling, who's another friend of mine. Was John singing about himself in How Do You Sleep, as he would proclaim in future interviews? Now, Owen's quite right in saying that John Lennon did say that. He also said that Steel and Glass, which is... John described it as son of How Do You Sleep, very similar to How Do You Sleep. That was apparently about Alan Klein. Now, obviously, if you take the lyrics literally, in How Do You Sleep, he's talking about, the only thing you've done was yesterday, since you're gone, you're just another day, and that's name-checking two of his songs. He mentioned Sgt. Pepper at the beginning. But, if we just take that first lyric, so Sgt. Pepper took you by surprise, that's very open-ended. Maybe that took John by surprise, that Paul could produce something as amazing as that. And he didn't produce it single-handedly, obviously, and there was quite a bit of collaboration if you read Hunter Davis's book. But it was driven by Paul, so maybe John was surprised about that, Did Sgt. Pepper take Paul by surprise? I don't know. I'm not sure. Paul seems like a guy who's generally in control, so maybe not. I'm not going to go through and analyse all the lyrics of that song, but I think there was some of John in there, yes. I think you do this with songs, because I'm a songwriter myself, and you project yourself into another situation, i.e. his anger at Paul McCartney, and some of your song is directly about that, but some of that is using that context, and then you just let lyrics come out. And I think John Lennon, you could argue, apart from perhaps, there's some time in New York City where he's literally talking about causes and absolutely name-checking them. I think the rest of his work, there's always a bit of himself in there, particularly I would say from 65. You could argue the very early songs, is there much of John Lennon in She Loves You? That's a third-person story, but then you've got There's a Place and I'll Cry Instead, I'm a Loser. They're all pre-65. And then from 65 onwards, he's really putting himself in it. So to answer the question, I would say not entirely singing about himself, but through the process of writing the song, using the context of his anger against Paul, I think he was to some extent singing about himself. Okay, the next one is from a gentleman called Jonathan Dayton, who's English but lives in Germany, and yes, happens to be my cousin as well. Was John Lennon as transformed by his experience with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in the way that George Harrison seemed to be? Well, one of the things of being a massive Beatles fan and becoming a quote-unquote expert by reading lots of books and knowing lots of things about them, one of the frustrations that comes with that is that you'd probably trade all that knowledge to actually be a fly on the wall for, even half an hour or something, in a Beatles recording session, because you read more and more books, but then it becomes more and more clear that you weren't actually there, so you don't know the truth. But all I was going to say about that was that if I could place myself anywhere inside the world of the Beatles and be exposed to that, it would probably be inside John Lennon's head while he was in Rishikesh and doing the meditation, because to me that's an incredible time that I want to read more books about that. That's one of the periods, the Rishikesh period, and I think there is a book in the pipeline that's about that, which should clear a lot of things up. But I think it was so incredible. It was a detox period. I mean, I think they did bring some weed apparently, and they may have had a drink or two, but I think John Lennon was off hard drugs, including alcohol as a hard drug, potentially, spirits and so forth, for the first time in a long time. So it was a detox. They'd been through all the madness of Beatlemania. And I think, John Lennon was probably, through meditation, was processing, all the deaths that happened to him. Uncle George, his mother, Stuart Sutcliffe, Bride Epstein, of course. So I think there must have been an incredible time. So I would say, Jonathan, to answer your question, I think he was transformed by the Rishikesh experience, but I don't think he ever went as hard on the meditation as George did. I remember John Lennon was a man of whims. He would embrace something for a while. Someone actually did a breakdown that his identity seemed to change every 18 months from mid-60s to the mid-70s before he went into basically a 5-year retreat. So I don't think he ever had the dedication that George had, because George, of course, never denounced the Maharishi. He apparently, according to John Lennon, he had some doubts about the idea that the Maharishi may have been seducing someone in the ashram, and that's why they left. But I've never quite bought that. I always thought that was more of a Magic Alex thing, and I think maybe John Lennon was wanted to get out of there. Maybe he wanted to get back to his normal life. Who knows? But I think the detox aspect combined with the meditation did have a massive influence. And of course, when he came back from Rishikesh, he went on a massive acid bender and drug bender. That was where he famously met Brigitte Bardot, was in no condition to further their acquaintance, let's say, and ended up apparently just talking gibberish to her and just saying all these cosmic things, and then her and her entourage left. I'll do an episode about John Lennon and his relationship with drugs, which I think was ever present, despite other books you might read, like Ray Coleman, for example. So I think it was a very important detox period, and I think it probably cemented the idea of getting into a relationship with Yoko Ono, which obviously did transform him again. For good or for bad, you can decide. Okay, now, psychology type question here from Edmund. How much was John Lennon's insecurity an essential part of his achievements? Well, this is kind of a theory that John Lennon, I think, agreed with, and I probably agree with as well. In the anthology book, one of the first quotes in the book was John Lennon saying something along the lines of, I'm only famous because of my repression. I'm only famous because I have a deeper need to say, Mummy and Daddy, look at me, now will you love me? That's more or less the quote that he gave. So I think there is something to that, yes. Obviously, there are people from very stable backgrounds who've made it in music. Give an example, Pink Floyd, let's say, leaving aside Syd Barrett. Obviously, Roger Waters had a troubled time, but the other three, Gilmore, Mason, and Richard Wright, as far as I know, they had fairly stable upbringings and didn't have any massive traumas in their life before they met Roger Waters, of course. It's another story. But there is something about people who do have high insecurity. Performing is one part of getting approval from people. And I mean, this would probably need a very, very long examination. But, you know, I'm part of a community of musicians here in Madrid, and there are some extraordinary characters among them. And I do see this, you know, people who are sort of very shy and very insecure, that drink and performing, and the combination of the two is very cathartic for them. So I would say his insecurity was probably quite a big part of it. The death of his mother, you cannot separate that from the rest of his life. That must have had a very, very profound effect on him. So I think the insecurity, it might make them push a bit further and maybe feel like they've got nothing to lose. Because, you know, a big part of making it in entertainment or creative industries, you know, like music and film and writing, etc. I haven't made it in those, so I'm not talking from personal experience, but it seems that nowadays, especially, being able to push yourself and sell yourself and market yourself and get good PR firm, that seems to be a big part of it. And maybe the insecure people are more prepared, or they're more crazy even, they're more prepared to go the extra mile, so to speak, to get out there, because there's a stronger need to have people looking at them and giving them attention. So the answer is, to a fairly large extent, I would say yes. Okay, next question, comment, in fact, comes from Kit O'Toole, who is a Beatles podcaster. She's part of the Talk More Talk podcast, which focuses on the solo years. And Kit says, the Lost Weekend period has always fascinated me in terms of misconceptions about his creativity. Supposedly he was a total mess, but look at what he produced, among other things, Walls and Bridges, one of his finest albums. Thanks for that, Kit. Very interesting talking point. Now, a thing I want to make absolutely clear, because I still don't think this is clear, the Lost Weekend doesn't primarily refer to the fact that John Lennon was lost and that it was a weekend, meaning a short period in his life, let's say 18 months. It comes from a film directed by Billy Wilder, who famously made such films as Double Indemnity and Some Like It Hot, and many other great films. He made a film starring Ray Milland called The Lost Weekend, and it's about an alcoholic. I think that's what John was referring to. Now, he might describe himself as lost, but I think the partying he did, it did get intense for a while. But if you read May Pang's book, there seemed to be an intense period of partying, but it didn't seem like it was 18 months. And of course, I think the most intense period was when they first attempted to record the rock and roll album in 1973 with Phil Spector, who is something of a colourful character. I think the partying affected that, but then John Lennon straightened himself out, you know. And also the other thing is that the body is quite resilient, and it is possible to party fairly hard and get stuff done. So I think rather naively separating those two things out, as people do, they say, oh, you've either got to be partying or you're being productive. You can easily do both things at the same time, particularly if you don't have a day job to get up for. Don't have to get up early and go to the office. You know, they had all day, so they could get wasted for a few hours and still be able to produce. And also, and by that point, you know, John Lennon was a fairly seasoned songwriter, so he's probably going to songwrite, as he said in an interview, you know, I'll probably do this forever because you can't help doing it. So I would say that he was probably, both parts of it are true, that he was getting messy, but he wasn't a total mess. And also John Lennon, we know he had a pretty low tolerance to alcohol, but also other people have attested that drugs-wise, you know, he was fairly resilient. He put his body through and his head through quite a lot of acid and came out the other side just about. You know, he came out in 1969 very energised while still doing heroin. You know, obviously the Let It Be period was a bit lethargic, but the rest of 1969 he was very much out there. So, yeah, I would say, you know, brief period of intense partying which did affect his work, and then perhaps a balance of the two. Walls and Bridges, yes, I agree. It's definitely one of his best albums, Kit. I would say there's a trick that you can pull off, I think, if you're a musician who does have certain habits to do with drink and drugs. You basically take the experiences that have happened on the drink and drugs, and then when you're in a lucid state, you use them to write material, either very consciously, subconsciously, sometimes perhaps unconsciously. So I think the parting and everything may have played a part in the songs of Walls and Bridges. I'm sure it did. But then, John Lennon was able to go straight, so to speak, for a period of time, because he was, of course, very professional, as many people have said, like Nicky Hopkins has said on the Imagine sessions. Yeah, he could get angry, but he was also very professional, very focused when he wanted to be, and was able to work very quickly and get things done without bullying people. So that's that one. Now, another Beatles podcaster, Mitch Axelrod from the Fab Four Free For All. Very good podcast, highly recommended. He says, if John was still with us, do you think he would be touring a lot like Paul does? If so, would he include a lot of Beatles songs in the set list? Now, I'm going to combine Mitch's questions with another question I got from a listener by email, which is, would John Lennon have embraced the anthology project? So, of course, this goes under the umbrella of what would John Lennon be doing now, or what would John Lennon have done if he hadn't been killed in 1980? I actually talk about this in the interview that I'm going to post next week, which I've already recorded. But to answer Mitch's question regarding the touring, I would say no, because I think when John Lennon was in his 30s, or even late 20s, post-Beatles, he didn't do much touring. That was always a little bit of a mystery. He did say that he was going to be going on tour in 1981 to play the Double Fantasy and what became the Milk and Honey songs. So it may have been revitalised to some extent, but I think a lot of it may just come down to laziness. Although Paul was apparently a major pothead who was still able to be majorly productive at the same time, he performed that balancing act. I think John Lennon was, as he said, a homebody. I think he just liked being at home, and he said he wasn't really massively into watching other people in concert either. So I'm sure he would have done some concerts, but no, I just don't think he was interested in the kind of public engagement that Paul is into, which is just lapping up that applause, night after night. So no to that one. And the second one, would he include Beatles songs? I think gradually, yes. I wouldn't say a lot of Beatles songs, but I think the ones that meant more to him, perhaps Help, Come Together, In My Life, perhaps, who knows. I think maybe a decent barometer of what John would have done would have been to look at George, because I think the John and George relationship, again, I think I said this in an interview that's going to be posted, but rather than George being Paul's baby brother, I would say he was a bit more John's baby brother, because he was sort of less extreme version of John. And I think in terms of John Lennon's embracing or otherwise of the anthology project, I think you have to look at what George's involvement and attitude to that was. And I don't know if people know this, but George Harrison actually mainly got involved in the anthology eventually, because he'd been majorly screwed over with his film company, Handmade Films. He'd lost millions because of his partner, and actually was in financial difficulty, and that was one of the things that pushed him to eventually do the anthology. So I think John would have probably had an attitude similar to that, probably gently poking fun at it. He would have turned up, he would have talked about the old days, I'm sure, but in a kind of detached way. As if you look at any of the videos of Paul, George and Ringo together, George is into it, they're sitting in his garden, so he's a bit more invested in that. And obviously he had Jeff Lynne, who was quote unquote his producer rather than Paul's guy. So John Lennon probably would have mellowed more and more over the years, but I just can't see him ever having the enthusiasm about talking about the Beatles that Paul McCartney has. Okay, got one final one. It's actually another one from Jonathan, my cousin. Came in at the 11th hour. Imagine is commonly interpreted as an atheist or humanist anthem, the implication being that there is no deeper spiritual truth. For me, it describes spiritual truth very clearly. Do we know at all what Lennon's position was? I'm going to interpret that as what was John Lennon's position on religion, I guess, or spiritual truth. I think, like his positions on many things, it probably changed a lot over the years. I think Imagine employs some artistic license in that it does deal in some absolutes, which I think is one of the reasons, apart from the melody and the arrangement and everything else, its simplicity is what gives it that universal appeal, rather like Give Peace a Chance. But, Give Peace a Chance is really just that one line. The verses are improvised there. Well, Imagine is a proper set of lyrics. But I think is it interpreted as an atheist anthem? Presumably because of just that one line, imagine and no religion too. I think he was just putting things out there, imagine this, imagine that. I think his idea was that you had to change your head. It's kind of what he was saying in Revolution. I think John Lennon's politics is a messy thing, and his beliefs as well. They're messy because they change a lot, and he contradicted himself a lot. But I think he was offering people a different mindset. I know that hasn't answered the question very sufficiently, but that's the best I can do at this moment in time. One thing about that, of course, the line that's lampooned really is "Imagine no possessions," because the video of Imagine has, Yoko opening the curtains in this huge room. Now, I'm not going to defend the fact that there is some contradiction in that line, but remember that John Lennon couldn't live in a normal house. I mean, the book written by Pete Shotton, who was his childhood best friend, talks about a night that they went to a normal pub, and it was okay for about 20 minutes, and then gradually more and more people came to ask him for autographs, and they all wanted a piece of him, So if you're John Lennon and you have money, plus you've got this mad Beatles fame that will never leave you alone whatever you do, you can't live in a normal, semi-detached two-bedroom, Now, regarding religion, there are some insiders who've said that John Lennon was looking at his relationship with Jesus Christ towards the end of his life, in fact. I see, the fact that he turned 40 as it is a time when you do reflect, and I think if I had to say which religious denomination, I'd probably say agnostic, I guess. So that's my unsatisfactory answer to Jonathan's question. But thanks to him and everyone else who's contributed questions and talking points. And I'm going to sign off now. And next week I have an interview. It's going to be the next 2 podcasts. I did another monster Skype interview with a Beatles podcaster. I'm not going to reveal who it is now. But I'll see you next Friday for that. And thanks for listening. Goodbye.